Hello, my friends. Tonight, I will take you on a journey into the glittering heart of France, a place that was once hailed as the most dazzling palace in all of Europe. Yet behind its golden mirrors and perfumed halls lay a nightmare of filth and decay, a paradox so grotesque that it would shock even the poorest beggar of the Middle Ages. I am speaking of Versailles, the grand palace of King Louis XIV, the Sun King, who on the 6th of May, in the year 1682, moved his court into what he believed was the supreme triumph of power, culture, and elegance, but instead created one of the most revolting living environments ever endured by the aristocracy. Tonight, let us peel back the shining facade and see the truth that was hidden beneath silk and jewels. When we imagine Versailles, we think of marble corridors stretching endlessly, of chandeliers dripping with crystal, of the Hall of Mirrors, where sunlight seemed to multiply into eternity. Yet the reality is that those very corridors often reeked of urine. Those gardens admired across the continent became open-air latrines, and those noble chambers were steeped in odours, so foul that visitors gagged upon entering. Imagine the contradictions: perfumes imported from grass, mixed in the air with human waste. Rose petals scattered over floors that had absorbed the stench of centuries. Ambassadors bowing before the king while stepping carefully to avoid what had been left by another courtier only hours earlier. Versailles was not just a palace. It was a golden sewer disguised as paradise. The dream had begun 2 decades earlier. In 1661, when Louis XIV decided to transform a simple hunting lodge into a monument that would outshine every throne in Europe, with architect Jules Hardouin-Mansart and landscape designer André Le Nôtre. He envisioned gardens that would make even the heavens jealous, halls that would humble emperors, and apartments fit for gods. He succeeded in building magnificence, but he ignored one simple, fatal truth: a palace that would house tens of thousands of nobles, guards, servants, and officials had no proper sanitation. There were no sewers, no public latrines, no planning at all for the most basic human needs. By the time the king officially moved his court in the year 1682, almost 20,000 souls lived within the walls of Versailles. What had once been a hunting lodge was now a suffocating city, and its infrastructure buckled immediately. Nobles, so richly dressed in lace and velvet, relieved themselves behind stairwells, in corners, or even in ceremonial halls. The gardens, so admired from afar, were soiled daily by courtiers who could not wait for relief. Marble staircases were slick with filth, and noble salons carried the unmistakable stench of a cesspool. Eyewitnesses wrote of how nearly impossible it was to walk without stepping in excrement. Even the most hardened courtiers were forced to cover their disgust with masks of indifference. The grand rituals of the court did not escape the nightmare either. Each morning, the lever du roi, the rising of the king, brought hundreds of nobles into the royal bedchamber to watch Louis XIV awaken. Yet the spectacle was accompanied by the overwhelming stench of body odour and waste. Madame de Maintenon, the king's secret wife, confessed in her letters that incense burned constantly in her chambers. But it barely masked the horror. She was forced to change her clothes several times a day, not for vanity, but because the fabric absorbed the smell of human waste. Banquets intended to display the splendour of France became exercises in humiliation. Diplomats and courtiers discreetly slipped behind curtains or into corners during feasts, desperate to relieve themselves. The Duchess of Orleans recorded in her diary an infamous event in the year 1687 when a high-ranking noble lost control of his bowels in full view of the court. Yet no one reacted. Silence and pretense were the rules of Versailles. To acknowledge the disgrace was to break the illusion, so the entire court ignored it, swallowing their disgust along with their food. As winters came, the misery deepened. In the bitter cold of 1683, few dared to venture outside, and the palace became a prison of odours. Water froze in basins, making washing almost impossible. Bathing was rare, and hygiene fell to medieval levels. Versailles became a breeding ground for disease, and by 1689, dysentery swept through the palace, killing dozens and leaving hundreds gravely ill. And still, the king refused to address the problem. Instead of sanitation, he demanded more perfume, more flowers, more incense, thinking that the mask of fragrance could cover the truth of decay. For the women of Versailles, the humiliation was even harsher. Dresses of towering complexity, with corsets and layers of fabric, made relieving oneself a challenge. Many avoided urination for hours, sometimes all day, leading to infections. Others simply soiled themselves, relying on perfumes to conceal the evidence. Beneath jewels and lace, they endured torments that remain difficult to imagine today. Even the act of eating was dangerous. Kitchens, far from the main halls, connected by corridors soaked with waste, often delivered food already contaminated. Food poisoning was common, and the cycle of illness never ended. And yet, despite all of this, the nobility remained silent. To live at Versailles was to bask in the presence of the Sun King. To complain was to risk exile. The price of privilege was suffering in silence, and so they endured, for decades, behind the shimmering mirrors and gilded ceilings. Nobles perfumed themselves and smiled, even as they literally lived in their own waste. This is the contradiction that makes Versailles one of the most haunting monuments in European history. It was built to embody the glory of France, but it revealed instead the rotting core of unchecked power. It was more than marble and gold. It was a warning written in stench. Versailles shows us that power obsessed with appearances while ignoring reality can create a nightmare that no perfume can mask. The palace dazzled visitors with beauty, but it poisoned those who lived inside. So, as we begin this story, remember this: Versailles was never only about elegance or majesty. It was about the cost of vanity, the blindness of absolute monarchy, and the humiliation of a court forced to live in filth while pretending to be divine. The Sun King believed his palace would shine forever as a beacon of civilization. But what he built was a golden coffin that preserved the smell of decay. In the chapters that follow, we will walk slowly through these halls of contradiction, uncovering how the most beautiful palace in the world became one of its most revolting prisons, and why the filth of Versailles was not only physical but also political, a symbol that helped ignite a revolution. Very well, my friends, let us continue the slow unraveling of this tale. For in part 1 we opened the golden gates of Versailles only to be met with the stench of its contradictions. And now in part 2 we will walk deeper into the corridors, letting the pace of the story settle into the calm rhythm of a bedtime reflection, a narrative long and heavy, like the velvet drapes of the palace itself, so that you may drift through the memories of a world where marble, silk, and human misery intertwined. The truth is that Versailles was never meant to be what it became, and that is perhaps the greatest irony of all. For in the year 1661, when the young Louis XIV first turned his eye upon the modest hunting lodge of his father, it was nothing more than a retreat, a small brick structure surrounded by forest, quiet ponds, and fields where the monarch and his companions could escape the burdens of Paris and chase stags across the countryside. And yet Louis, who had already tasted the chaos of rebellion during the Fronde, who had felt the trembling of a kingdom that might slip from his grasp, wanted a place where power would no longer be contested, where he could gather the nobility in one glittering cage and bind them not with chains, but with endless spectacle, ritual, and proximity to himself, the living son of France. Thus the transformation began, brick by brick and dream by dream, until the modest lodge grew into a construction site that never seemed to end, with thousands of workers laboring day and night under the watchful eye of architects like Laval and later Jules Hardouin-Mansart. While the genius of André Le Nôtre laid out gardens in geometries so precise, they seemed to defy nature itself, stretching into infinity with fountains, canals, and avenues of trees carved into shapes that pleased the king's eye. Yet, while masons carved marble, gilders laid sheets of gold, and gardeners moved mountains of earth, not a single serious plan was drawn for the flow of water and waste within the palace. And so from its very conception, Versailles was a miracle of appearance and a disaster of practicality, a stage built for performance without thought for the lives of its players. By the time Louis ordered his court to move permanently to Versailles in the year 1682, the skeleton of the dream had taken shape. The Hall of Mirrors was dazzling ambassadors. The king's apartments were ready to host the most elaborate ceremonies of waking and sleeping that Europe had ever seen, and nobles rushed to secure chambers within the golden prison, believing that proximity to the king would elevate their fortunes. But what awaited them was not glory alone, but also degradation. The palace that should have housed a few hundred comfortably now held nearly 20,000 souls. An entire city crammed into walls, never intended to hold such numbers. And the infrastructure sagged under the weight of ambition. Water for fountains was pumped at immense expense from the Seine. Yet there was no system for removing what flowed from human bodies. And so the very arteries of the palace clogged with filth, hidden behind gilded doors and beneath marble floors. The daily reality for nobles and servants alike soon became a grotesque parody of refinement. For while they dressed in silks and powdered their wigs, they relieved themselves in stairwells, in corners, and even in the gardens designed to embody paradise on earth. Imagine the sight of courtiers strolling among carefully manicured hedges, their perfume bottles clutched tightly, as they stepped past hedgerows tainted by waste. And imagine too the noble women in gowns so wide they could barely pass through doorways, forced to endure hours of discomfort, because to remove such clothing for relief was almost impossible, until at last they simply let nature take its course and drowned the evidence in clouds of fragrance. The palace was not simply unsanitary, it was humiliating, a place where dignity was sacrificed daily to the illusion of grandeur. And still the king demanded ceremony. For Louis XIV believed that spectacle itself was governance, that to see him eat, dress, and sleep was to see the living embodiment of France. And so the rituals went on regardless of the stench that filled the air. Each morning at the Lever du Roi, when nobles crowded the chamber to watch him rise, the air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and the ever-present undertone of waste. Yet silence was the rule. No one dared to flinch or cover their nose, because to show disgust was to insult the Sun King. Madame de Maintenon, in her letters, lamented how even constant incense and flowers could not drive away the odor, how fabrics absorbed the stench until she was forced to change several times a day. And she confessed that life at Versailles was less about elegance than endurance. The winters were worst of all, because when the bitter cold descended in the year 1683, no one dared to relieve themselves outdoors, and so the filth multiplied inside the palace itself. Corridors slick, staircases stained, and salons overwhelmed, until even hardened courtiers whispered their disgust, though never aloud to the king. And yet Louis did not act, for to admit the problem was to admit imperfection, and he would rather drown Versailles in perfume than admit to the existence of waste. Thus began the culture of masking rather than mending, of hiding beneath fragrance and etiquette, the realities that grew more poisonous by the year. And this culture would remain long after Louis himself had gone. For the servants, life was even more unbearable. For while nobles at least had chambers to hide their indignities, servants often slept in corridors or tucked themselves into corners. Their bodies weary, their dignity stripped. They carried chamber pots through halls dripping with gold, only to empty them where they could, for there was no system to take the waste away. Food travelled the same corridors, passing the same corners where filth had been left. And so illness became constant. Stomach sickness and infections, spreading like shadows through the palace. By the year 1689, dysentery erupted, a natural consequence of so much waste and so little hygiene, killing dozens and leaving hundreds in agony. And still, the king refused to address the issue. For the women of the court, the humiliation was constant and cruel. Corsets and layered gowns made even the smallest relief a trial, and many chose to suffer in silence, holding themselves until pain became unbearable, while others gave up, staining their clothing and masking the evidence with perfumes. Urinary infections were rampant, skin diseases common, and yet the myth of elegance persisted. For to be seen at Versailles was to be seen at the centre of the world, even if it meant living in misery. Beneath the powdered wigs and sparkling jewels, behind the lace and the smiles, the noble women of Versailles carried the silent burden of a palace that celebrated appearance while destroying the body. And what of the foreign ambassadors, those men who travelled from England, Spain, and Austria to marvel at the Sun King's grandeur? They reported back not only of splendour but of horror, writing that Versailles could only be endured by those with dead nostrils and iron stomachs, that beneath the brilliance lay rot. Yet even their reports could not pierce the illusion, for as long as the king lived, Versailles remained the centre of power, and so the silence continued. This then was the great paradox of Versailles. In its first decades it was at once the most beautiful palace in the world and the most revolting place to live. A palace where chandeliers sparkled above floors stained with excrement, where perfumes worth fortunes were wasted trying to battle the odour of human neglect, and where nobles endured humiliation daily in exchange for the fleeting honour of proximity to the king. Versailles was not just a building, it was a stage, and everyone inside was an actor forced to perform elegance while standing knee-deep in degradation. As we close this part of the story, let the image remain clear in your mind. Versailles, gleaming on the outside, was already rotting within. It was conceived as a golden cage to contain the nobility, and in that it succeeded, for no one complained, no one rebelled, and everyone played their part in the masquerade. But the price was dignity, and the cost was health. In the next part, we shall move deeper still, to the rituals that defined life at Versailles. Rituals where the body itself became a prisoner of etiquette, and where the contrast between the dream of civilization and the reality of filth grew ever sharper. My dear listeners, as we drift deeper into the shadowed brilliance of Versailles, we now arrive at part 3, where the illusion of elegance and the reality of filth meet most directly. Not in hidden corners, but in the very corridors where kings and nobles walked, where perfumes mingled with excrement, where chandeliers glittered above marble floors, stained with the secrets no one dared to speak. And it is here, in these endless passageways, that the contradiction of Versailles becomes not just rumour, but daily life, a truth that no velvet curtain or perfumed fan could completely conceal. The corridors of Versailles were meant to be arteries of splendour, designed to carry processions of courtiers dressed in silk, ambassadors from distant lands, and musicians whose violins filled the air with sweetness. Yet these same corridors became conduits of waste, places where nobles, unable to find relief elsewhere, left behind the most human of traces, and the smell of it lingered in the air long after the act was done. Imagine walking behind a duchess whose gown sparkled with jewels, while your feet slipped on something foul upon the marble. And imagine turning a corner into a gallery lit by hundreds of candles, only to be met not with admiration, but with nausea. For the perfume in the air could never fully mask the odor that clung to the stone. During the harsh winter of 1683, this reality grew even more unbearable, for the freezing cold forced life indoors. And while the gardens outside were built as places of beauty, in winter they could not serve even their base purpose as open-air latrines. And so the palace itself became the dumping ground for thousands of bodies. Servants swept constantly. Chamber pots were carried through the very same passages where banquets and ceremonies were held. But the sheer volume of filth overwhelmed every effort, and the palace became not a marvel but a cesspit. The corridors, wide enough for whole processions, became slick with filth, and noble salons, those spaces where wit and laughter were supposed to sparkle like champagne, carried the heavy, unmistakable stench of rot. It was not simply that the corridors were dirty, it was that they were symbolic. They revealed what Versailles truly was: a palace built for show and not for life. A monument that cared only for the eye and never for the body. The courtiers who strutted through these halls, holding their heads high, had no choice but to pretend not to notice. For silence was the price of remaining in the Sun King's light. To complain was to risk exile. To leave Versailles was to leave power. And so they endured, their dignity sacrificed upon the altar of proximity to the king. Consider the king's own rituals, such as the lever du roi, the rising of Louis XIV, an event where hundreds of nobles crowded into his bedchamber to watch him awaken. A ceremony meant to display majesty, yet what surrounded it was far from majestic. For the corridors leading to the chamber were heavy with the odor of waste and sweat, and the nobles themselves, unwashed for days or even weeks, carried the musk of their own neglect. The perfumes they wore only thickened the air, mixing with the smell of urine in the stairwells and excrement in the corners, until the very atmosphere became an ordeal. Still, they smiled. Still, they bowed. Still, they flattered. For the performance of elegance mattered more than the truth of survival. Madame de Maintenon, who became the king's secret wife, confessed in her letters that even with incense burning day and night, the stench could never be conquered, and that the fabrics of her gowns absorbed it so deeply that she was forced to change multiple times each day. She described the horror of walking into noble salons where the air was thick and suffocating, where the laughter of courtiers did not disguise the curling of their lips as they fought the urge to gag. It was as if Versailles itself was laughing at them, mocking their jewels and lace, reminding them that beneath the gold leaf and marble lay something more primitive than the filthiest of medieval towns. In these corridors, the contrast between luxury and squalor became unbearable. The chandeliers glittered. The mirrors multiplied the glow of candlelight. And yet below, nobles stepped carefully, praying not to soil their slippers, while servants carried chamber pots brimming with waste through the very same passageways where ambassadors once marveled at France's power. The sound of music played at balls was accompanied by the quieter, less noble sounds of bodies relieving themselves in corners. And while courtiers laughed at gossip, they dared not mention the smell that clung to every wall. One of the most shocking incidents, recorded by the Duchess of Orléans, occurred during a ball in 1687, when a high-ranking noble lost control of his bowels in full view of the court. The musicians played on, the dancers continued their steps, and no one said a word. This silence was perhaps more chilling than the act itself, for it showed that at Versailles, etiquette had grown so twisted that it demanded the denial of reality. The court would rather pretend that nothing had happened than admit the humiliation of living in such conditions. This was not dignity, it was collective delusion, a ritual of denial repeated day after day, until filth became invisible. Not because it was gone, but because it was unspoken. The corridors of Versailles, then, they were not just places of passage, but stages for this performance of denial. They were lined with portraits of kings and queens, hung with tapestries of triumph, and beneath them, nobles tiptoed around excrement, holding their heads high as though the stink did not exist. The servants who cleaned did so endlessly, yet the waste returned as quickly as it was removed, a tide that could not be stemmed. And so Versailles itself became a metaphor, a palace where splendor and rot lived side by side, inseparable and undeniable. Even foreign ambassadors, who came to Versailles expecting to be dazzled, wrote home not only of grandeur but of disgust. They described the palace as habitable only for those with dead nostrils and iron stomachs, a place where beauty was an illusion and reality was poison. Yet these reports did little to tarnish Versailles' reputation in the short term, for the myth of the Sun King was stronger than the truth. Still, the corridors whispered the secret, whispered it to anyone who walked them, that this palace was not a triumph of civilization, but a warning of what happens when appearances matter more than life itself. As we linger in these hallways in our imagination, let us not forget the women whose gowns brushed against filth as they moved from salon to salon, the servants whose bare hands carried chamber pots through golden galleries, the children who played in spaces that reeked of neglect. The corridors of Versailles bore witness to all of them, and they carried their stories in silence, in the smell that no perfume could fully erase. The grandeur of Versailles was real, yes, but so too was its degradation. And in these passageways, the two collided most violently. So let us close this part with the image clear before our eyes, the gilded corridors, lit by candles, echoing with music and laughter. And yet beneath the sparkle, the marble slick with filth, the air heavy with contradictions, the palace itself transformed into a golden sewer where denial became etiquette and silence became survival. In the next chapter, we will turn from the corridors to the rituals that masked these horrors, the incense and roses that were used not to honor beauty, but to conceal decay. And in that part of the story, we will see how Versailles became less a palace and more a masquerade, where fragrance fought endlessly against rot, and where the mask of elegance grew heavier with each passing year. My dear friends, let us drift even further into the labyrinth of Versailles. For in part 3, we lingered in the corridors where chandeliers and excrement shared the same air, where nobles tiptoed through marble halls that had become disguised latrines. And now in part 4, we must examine the mask that was pulled across this filth, the endless waves of incense, flowers, and perfume that sought to hide what could not be cleansed, and in doing so created a masquerade that was not only physical but spiritual, a performance of fragrance and denial that symbolized the very essence of Louis XIV's rule, where appearances mattered more than truth, where illusion was mistaken for civilization, and where a golden palace became a theater of rot beneath roses. The Sun King had always understood the power of symbols, for he was a monarch who believed that to be seen was to rule, that to control the senses of his court was to control their souls. And so when the stench of Versailles grew unbearable, when nobles gagged silently in salons heavy with waste, his solution was not to dig sewers or build latrines, but to summon perfumers, florists, and priests of incense, transforming the palace into a battlefield where odor fought odor. and fragrance became the sword that defended the illusion of elegance. Flowers were delivered by the cartload, roses and lilies filling chambers, until their sweetness overwhelmed. Incense burned day and night, filling the king's apartments with a smoky haze that stung the eyes but dulled the nose. And perfumes, distilled from rare blossoms, were sprinkled onto fabrics, rubbed into wigs, and even poured onto floors, so that the palace would at least smell like paradise, even as it rotted beneath. Madame de Maintenon, in her private letters, confessed the futility of this war against stench, writing of how her gowns absorbed the odours of the palace so completely that she was forced to change multiple times each day. Not for vanity, but for survival. For the smell clung to fabric like a ghost, refusing to be shaken off. And she spoke of how the incense burned constantly in her rooms, yet never fully conquered the scent of waste. It was as if the palace itself exhaled decay, and no perfume, however rare, could mask its breath. Nobles arriving at the lever du roi, the king's morning ritual, came powdered and perfumed, their wigs drenched in fragrance, and yet as soon as they gathered, the mingling of human bodies, the absence of washing, and the proximity of hidden filth created an atmosphere almost unbearable. But silence was required, for to complain was to risk exile. And so the mask was worn, the mask of roses that pretended nothing was wrong. Banquet, meant to display the majesty of France, became scenes where this mask was stretched to breaking point. Tables groaned with delicacies, goblets glittered with wine, musicians played with passion, and yet behind curtains and in corners, courtiers slipped away to relieve themselves, their absence covered by the endless flow of conversation and music. The stench was never absent, but etiquette demanded it be ignored, and so the fragrances of roasted meats and perfumes clashed with the acrid undertone of excrement, a grotesque harmony that only Versailles could compose. It was not merely a matter of comfort, it was a humiliation dressed as refinement, a court forced to pretend that roses alone could make a sewer into a sanctuary. Even the gardens, the pride of André Le Nôtre, those geometries of perfection admired across Europe, became tainted. For while fountains sparkled and flower beds bloomed, nobles and servants alike used the hedges as latrines. And so the fragrance of roses mingled with filth, and the mask spread outdoors as well. Visitors admired the design, yet those who lingered too long discovered the truth beneath the blossoms. That Versailles was not paradise, but a golden latrine disguised with petals. The irony was cruel, for the very flowers meant to honor beauty became weapons in a war against truth, and the incense that was supposed to elevate the soul became a fog that dulled the senses. For the women of Versailles, this mask was especially cruel, for their gowns were prisons of silk and whalebone, making relief a near impossibility. And so they endured hours of discomfort until their bodies betrayed them, and then they drenched themselves in perfume to conceal the evidence. Chronic infections, skin diseases, and humiliation became the price of participation in court life. Yet the mask demanded silence. To smell of roses was to remain acceptable, even if one's body was screaming with pain. The lace and jewels became less symbols of elegance than chains of etiquette, binding women to a system that cared nothing for their dignity, only for their appearance. The mask extended even to religion, for incense burned in chapels not only as offering to God, but as offering to the nose, disguising the odor that crept even into sacred spaces. Priests intoned prayers while courtiers fanned themselves against the haze of smoke, their eyes watering, their throats raw, yet all pretended that this was devotion rather than desperation. Versailles was a palace where even worship was scented, where faith itself was perfumed to conceal the unholy reality lurking in the walls. And so, Fragrance became Versailles' second skin, a mask that grew heavier with every passing year. Diplomats noticed it, recording in their reports that the palace reeked of incense and flowers so heavily it was suffocating, as though the perfumes themselves were trying to strangle the truth. And still they whispered of the stench that lingered beneath. Etiquette adjusted itself to protect the illusion, inventing rules and rituals that shifted attention away from reality. When Madame de Pompadour, in the year 1755, stepped onto the grand staircase and ruined her white silk shoes in human filth before foreign ambassadors, the solution was not sanitation but a decree forbidding light-coloured shoes at court, a rule as absurd as it was revealing. Versailles did not change the truth. It changed the mask, always adjusting the illusion so that the rot could continue unseen. The mask of roses and incense was more than physical. It was political. It embodied the very nature of absolute monarchy, a system obsessed with grandeur while ignoring reality. Louis XIV believed that to appear magnificent was to be magnificent, that to shine in mirrors was to shine in history. And so he allowed the mask to grow until it became the very essence of Versailles. The palace itself became a metaphor, golden on the outside, perfumed within, but hollowed by filth and denial. This was not civilization, but a masquerade. And the longer it continued, the more grotesque it became. As the decades passed, the mask failed more and more often. Illness spread. Dysentery claimed lives. Ambassadors reported horrors. Yet still the perfumes burned. Still the incense smoked. Still, the roses were brought daily to chambers that stank of waste. Versailles became less a palace and more a theatre, a stage where the actors played their roles in gowns and wigs, pretending that elegance reigned supreme, even as their bodies suffered. And in this theatre, the truth was the one character forbidden to appear. So let us close this part with the image of Versailles suffocating under its own mask, a palace drenched in perfume, its corridors heavy with incense, its gardens overflowing with roses, and yet beneath it all, the undeniable reek of filth rising like a ghost. The mask may have fooled the world for a time, but those who lived within its walls knew the truth. And the truth was that Versailles was a masquerade of misery, a palace that taught the world a lesson. It would not forget that no amount of incense, no mountain of roses, no sea of perfume can hide decay forever. In the next part, we shall turn to the inevitable consequence of this masquerade, the epidemics that swept through the golden halls, when the mask slipped and the palace revealed itself not as a triumph of civilization, but as a breeding ground of death. My dear friends, we have walked together through the gilded corridors of Versailles, where perfumes clashed with excrement, where roses and incense became masks, stretched thin across the stench of a palace built on denial. And now in part 5, we must linger in the shadow of consequence. For when filth is ignored long enough, it does not simply offend the nose. It begins to poison the body. And Versailles, beneath its golden ceilings and marble floors, became a breeding ground, not for civilization, but for epidemics that revealed the true cost of ignoring the most basic needs of human life. Disease at Versailles was not a rare visitor, but a constant companion, creeping through the corridors like a silent spectre, thriving in the damp corners where waste collected, flourishing in the stagnant air that perfumed smoke could never fully cleanse. And by the late 1680s, the consequences could no longer be hidden behind etiquette or incense. In the year 1689, a dysentery epidemic swept through the palace, striking nobles and servants alike, killing dozens and leaving hundreds weakened and bedridden. And the connection was obvious to anyone willing to admit the truth. For the waste that seeped into stairwells and corners, the chamber pots carried along corridors where food was transported, the contamination of kitchens with the stench of sewage, All of it conspired to transform Versailles from a palace into a laboratory of contagion. The irony was cruel. For Versailles had been conceived as the supreme proof of French superiority, the jewel of Europe, the Sun King's eternal monument. Yet within its walls, nobles died of diseases, more fitting to medieval slums than to the most sophisticated court in the world. The stench that clung to gowns and wigs was not only humiliation but danger. For fabrics carried more than odour. They carried infection. And the perfumes that nobles doused themselves with were as powerless against disease as they were against filth. The palace itself became a trap, where proximity to the king meant proximity also to sickness, and where silence in the face of decay ensured that no remedy would come. The kitchens of Versailles became another source of plague, for they were placed far from the banquet halls and connected to them by long corridors that often doubled as waste passageways. And so food carried for royal feasts passed through air heavy with contamination. And dishes meant to display refinement sometimes delivered illness instead. Food poisoning was common. Stomach sickness, a familiar curse. And yet the banquets continued. The tables groaned with delicacies, and the courtiers laughed and flattered, even as their stomachs rebelled. For to complain was to risk exclusion from the centre of power, and exclusion from Versailles was a kind of death in itself. For the women of the court, the epidemics took an especially cruel toll. For their bodies were already punished by fashion that forced them into corsets and gowns that made even the simplest relief impossible. And the urinary infections that plagued them grew worse in a palace without sanitation. Many suffered in silence, relying on perfumes to conceal their humiliation. But illness spread through their bodies, and the physicians of the court, bound by tradition more than science, offered little help. Bloodletting and purges were prescribed, while the true cause of disease, the waste that filled Versailles, remained unacknowledged. Thus the palace became not a triumph of medical knowledge, but a shrine to ignorance, where appearances mattered more than survival. The epidemics revealed more than the weakness of bodies. They revealed the weakness of the monarchy itself. For if a king who claimed to be the sun could not even provide clean water and sanitation for his own court, how could he claim to govern a nation? Yet Louis XIV chose denial over reform, doubling down on perfumes and flowers, insisting that fragrance could conquer contagion. And so the palace festered. The courtiers, desperate for survival, played along, pretending that incense was medicine, that roses were protection. But in their private letters they confessed horror. Ambassadors reported that Versailles was habitable only for those with dead nostrils and iron stomachs. And the myth of elegance began to crack beneath the weight of disease. As decades passed, the epidemics did not vanish. They merely became routine, woven into the fabric of court life like the stench itself. Dysentery, fevers, stomach sickness, and infections recurred again and again, killing quietly, weakening constantly, eroding dignity day by day. The nobles learned to live with illness as they lived with filth, in silence, for to speak of it was to risk exclusion, and so their bodies bore the cost of proximity to power. Versailles became a golden coffin, not only for the monarchy that would one day fall, but for the countless bodies that suffered within its walls. Their deaths unrecorded, except in whispers and letters. Their suffering drowned beneath the music of endless ceremonies. And yet, the epidemics were not confined to servants or lesser nobles. Even those closest to the king were not immune. At banquets, at dances, at the king's daily rituals, illness struck without discrimination. For filth made no distinction between high and low, between silk and rags. The Sun King himself, though shielded by privilege, could not entirely escape the stench that haunted his palace. And though history records him as triumphant, the truth is that his greatest monument was poisoned from within. The epidemics were Versailles' revenge upon its builders, proof that gold cannot silence disease, that mirrors cannot hide infection, and that no crown can protect a body from the consequences of neglect. The psychological toll was equally devastating. For to live in Versailles was to live in constant fear of illness, to wonder whether each banquet dish would bring delight or death, to endure the humiliation of a body betrayed by infection, while still forced to appear elegant and refined. It was a theatre of survival, where nobles acted their roles while their stomachs churned, and where silence was the greatest cruelty. For the truth was known, but never spoken. Versailles taught its inhabitants not only how to flatter, but how to endure. Not only how to bow, but how to suffer. And the epidemics carved their lessons into the very bones of the court. By the 18th century, the problem had grown so undeniable that timid attempts were made to address it. In 1728, under Louis XV, private latrines were constructed, but only for the royal family, leaving the thousands of courtiers, servants, and officials to continue living as before. This half-solution revealed more than it concealed, for it exposed the gulf between king and court. The creation of a sanitary hierarchy that mirrored the social divisions of France itself. The royal family enjoyed a small measure of relief, while the rest of the palace drowned in waste. The mask remained, but it was thinner now, and the whispers grew louder. Foreign ambassadors carried those whispers back to their courts, describing Versailles as a golden sewer, a palace of perfume and disease. And France's reputation as the pinnacle of refinement began to erode. The epidemics that plagued Versailles were no longer just private scandals but political dynamite. Metaphors of filth standing for the corruption of the monarchy itself. Revolutionary pamphlets would later seize upon these truths, describing Versailles as a gilded tomb where nobles wallowed in filth while the people starved. And in those pamphlets, the epidemics became not only physical, but symbolic. Proof that the monarchy was rotten beyond repair. Let us close this part with the image of Versailles as a palace of contagion. Its chandeliers glittering above bodies weakened by disease. Its gardens blooming, even as fevers spread. Its mirrors reflecting not glory but decay. The epidemics of Versailles were not accidents but inevitabilities. The price of a palace built on denial. The cost of appearances valued above life. They remind us that civilization is not measured by gold or marble, but by clean water, by sanitation, by dignity. And in this most basic test, Versailles failed completely. In the next part, we will see how this failure was laid bare not only in disease but in humiliation. When the mask of fragrance slipped and nobles found themselves disgraced in moments that revealed the absurdity of life within the golden sewer. My dear listeners, we have now followed Versailles through its corridors of perfume and filth, through its heavy mask of roses and incense, through its cycles of epidemic and silence, and in part 6 we must step onto the grand staircase itself, the very symbol of ceremony and spectacle, where the court gathered in jewels and brocade to display its magnificence. And yet it was here, in the most visible stage of all, that the illusions of Versailles faltered and humiliation spilled across silk shoes, reminding all that beneath the gold, the palace was nothing but a sewer, and that the rituals of etiquette were nothing more than desperate attempts to ignore reality. The story that has come down to us takes place in the year 1755, long after the reign of Louis XIV had ended, during the age of his successor's grandson, Louis XV, whose court was just as gilded, just as perfumed, and just as filthy as before. Madame de Pompadour, the king's powerful mistress and one of the most influential women in France, ascended the palace's grand staircase during a formal reception, her gown of immaculate silk glistening, her hair arranged in elaborate curls, powdered to perfection. Her shoes made of the whitest, most delicate silk that Parisian craftsmen could produce. Ambassadors from across Europe stood watching. Diplomats from courts where Versailles was still imagined to be the pinnacle of refinement. And for a moment the illusion seemed to hold. The palace shone as the golden heart of civilization. And then it happened, before their eyes. The mistress of the king stepped directly into human excrement, left upon the marble stair. The silk of her shoes was ruined instantly. The stain spreading, the smell undeniable, and the humiliation unbearable. Here was Versailles unmasked in a single step. The palace of roses and perfumes revealed as a latrine where even the most powerful woman could not escape disgrace. The ambassadors were stunned, though silence, as always, prevailed. No one dared cry out. No one dared laugh. For to acknowledge what had happened would be to shatter the illusion, and so the moment was swallowed into the ritual of denial. But its sting remained, not only for Madame de Pompadour but for the court itself, which now had to face whispers that spread beyond its walls. What followed was not reform, not the construction of proper latrines, not an honest reckoning with the filth that stained Versailles, but a new rule of etiquette, absurd in its pettiness. From that day forward, courtiers were forbidden from wearing light-coloured shoes in the palace, for light shoes revealed the truth too easily. They showed the stains of reality, and so rather than address the problem, Versailles simply changed the rules of fashion. Darker shoes became the mask that hid filth, and etiquette bent once more to protect illusion rather than life. This decree was both comic and tragic, a reminder that the palace did not exist to solve problems but to conceal them, that the monarchy itself was more interested in appearances than in dignity. The symbolism was powerful, for in that ruined pair of silk shoes, one could see the entire fate of Versailles. It was a palace where every problem was answered, not with reality but with performance, where even excrement on a marble stair became a matter of etiquette rather than of reform. The nobility adapted, as they always did, tiptoeing through halls that reeked, adjusting their fashion to survive humiliation. But the deeper truth was clear. Versailles was not merely an uncomfortable residence. It was a stage upon which the absurdity of absolute monarchy played itself out. And the audience was the world. Foreign ambassadors carried the story back to their courts, and the whispers grew. Versailles, they said, was magnificent from afar, but disgusting up close. A place where elegance was a mask, stretched over filth, where perfume could not hide the truth forever. For the French people themselves, the scandal became another reminder of the detachment of their rulers. For while peasants struggled for bread, the court obsessed over shoe colour as a solution to human waste. It was not only grotesque, it was insulting. And every humiliation at Versailles added fuel to a fire that would one day consume the monarchy. And yet life at Versailles went on. The ceremonies continued. The balls glittered. The feasts dazzled. And the nobles endured. They continued to bow before the king, to laugh at his jokes, to flatter his mistresses, all while stepping carefully to avoid the filth at their feet. Silence was the price of proximity to power, and no one dared to speak truth aloud. To live at Versailles was to accept humiliation as the cost of privilege, to believe that ruined shoes were less important than ruined favour, and so they smiled through their disgust, hiding the truth beneath layers of etiquette. For the women of the court, the humiliation was doubled, for fashion itself became complicit in their suffering. Gowns grew ever more elaborate, corsets ever more restrictive, shoes ever more fragile, and each detail made life at Versailles more unbearable. To walk through halls slick with filth in shoes of silk was not only uncomfortable but degrading. A reminder that the palace cared more for display than for survival. Many women learned to carry small sachets of perfume in their sleeves, ready to mask any odor that clung to their clothes. But no amount of lavender or rose could erase the memory of stepping into excrement before an audience of the world. The symbolism of that staircase incident endured, for Versailles itself was like a silk shoe ruined upon marble, beautiful from afar, but destroyed by contact with reality. The palace glittered in paintings and in the reports of flatterers, but within its walls, nobles knew the truth. And the truth was filth. The new rule of dark shoes was more than etiquette. It was metaphor, a symbol of how absolute power adjusted appearances rather than addressing reality. How a monarchy more concerned with ceremony than with life condemned itself to eventual collapse. By the time Louis XV had grown old, Versailles was already losing its shine. Its reputation eroded not only by scandal and filth, but by the absurdity of its etiquette. Foreigners mocked the palace. Pamphlets circulated in Paris comparing it to a sewer, and the French themselves began to see it less as a symbol of glory than as a symbol of corruption. The humiliation of Madame de Pompadour's shoes was not forgotten. It was remembered as proof that Versailles was not paradise but prison. Not elegance, but absurdity. And so we leave this part of the story with the image of that staircase, glittering with candles, lined with nobles in brocade, echoing with music and chatter, and yet stained with human waste. The place where silk shoes were ruined, and with them the dignity of a court. Versailles was a palace where humiliation was inevitable, where even the most powerful mistress could not escape disgrace, and where solutions were never real, only masks of etiquette. In the next part, we will turn to Marie Antoinette herself, the queen who tried in her own way to bring cleanliness and comfort to Versailles, yet whose gilded bathtubs became symbols, not of reform but of detachment, proof that the monarchy had lost all touch with the suffering of its people, and whose efforts, far from saving Versailles, only deepened its reputation as the golden coffin of a rotten regime. My dear friends, we now arrive at part 7 of our long walk through the golden labyrinth of Versailles. And as the story deepens, we step into the time of a woman whose name has been bound forever to both extravagance and tragedy, Marie Antoinette, the Austrian princess who became Queen of France, and whose every breath at Versailles was watched, judged, and twisted into legend, for it was she who tried, in her own way, to bring some measure of comfort, some hint of modernity to the palace. Yet in doing so, she only confirmed the people's suspicion that their monarchy had lost all sense of reality. For while the nation starved, she commissioned gilded bathtubs. While the streets of Paris cried for bread, she sought relief in scented water. And while the courtiers continued their rituals of denial, she added one more layer to the mask, making Versailles less a palace of reform than a symbol of detachment from suffering. By the time Marie Antoinette entered Versailles in the 1770s, the palace was already infamous for its filth, its stench, its humiliation of nobles forced to live in conditions worse than medieval towns. And though attempts had been made under Louis XV to construct a handful of private latrines for the royal family, the vast majority of residents, tens of thousands of nobles and servants, still endured the daily nightmare of relieving themselves in stairwells, gardens, and corners. The Queen, born into the disciplined and structured world of the Austrian court, was appalled by what she found, for in Vienna there had been at least some regard for sanitation. And though she was no revolutionary, she recognized that Versailles was not only uncomfortable, but degrading. In her private moments, she expressed disgust at the odors that clung to her gowns, the endless need to douse herself in perfume, the humiliation of rituals carried out in an atmosphere of rot, and she sought to carve out a space of cleanliness for herself within the golden prison. Her solution was to commission private bathing chambers, places where she could retreat from the stench and soak in scented water. Places that were not public rituals, but private sanctuaries. For the Queen, the bathtub became more than luxury. It was survival. A defense against the filth that pressed in from every corridor. She insisted on stricter rules for her attendants, demanding more frequent washing, greater attention to linens, and an effort to keep her private apartments free of the odors that permeated the rest of the palace. To her, these were small measures of dignity, gestures of self-preservation in a place where dignity was otherwise denied. Yet to the people of France, these very gestures became symbols of detachment, proof that, while the masses endured hunger and misery, their queen was bathing in gilded tubs. The paradox of Marie Antoinette's efforts is haunting. In truth, her private baths did little to change Versailles itself. The corridors remained slick with filth. The gardens continued to serve as latrines, and the air of the palace was still a war between perfume and decay. The Queen's apartments may have been cleaner, more fragrant, and more bearable, but the wider palace festered, as it always had. Yet in the eyes of the people, her very attempt at comfort became scandal. Pamphlets whispered of her extravagance, exaggerating the luxury of her baths, portraying her not as a woman seeking dignity, but as a tyrant indifferent to suffering. They said she soaked in milk while children in Paris starved. They said she wasted fortunes on silks and perfumes, while peasants had no bread. And whether true or not, these stories spread like wildfire, fueling anger that would one day explode into revolution. The gilded baths became a metaphor, not for reform, but for alienation. They revealed how far removed the monarchy had become from its people, how Versailles itself had grown into a symbol not of France's greatness but of its corruption. For every rose petal sprinkled in the Queen's bath, there was a family in the countryside without food. For every perfumed linen that touched her skin, there was a peasant child shivering in rags. The Queen, who may have only sought relief from humiliation, became instead the embodiment of aristocratic detachment, and Versailles, already infamous as a golden sewer, now became a political weapon, its filth described in pamphlets as a mirror of the monarchy's moral decay. Inside the palace, life went on as before. Nobles continued to endure the rituals of degradation in silence. Servants still carried chamber pots through marble halls. Banquets were still held in rooms where odours clung to the draperies. But in the Queen's chambers, there was at least the illusion of order. Her baths were filled with scented water, her apartments cleaned with greater care, and her gowns less stained with the odours of the palace. Yet even within her sanctuary, the truth could not be fully escaped. The stench of Versailles seeped through walls, lingered in fabrics, and haunted every ritual of court life. Even in water perfumed with roses, one could not entirely wash away the reality of a palace built on denial. The Queen's force, rather than endearing her to her people, became fuel for caricature. Satirical prints circulated depicting her surrounded by perfumes and luxuries while France rotted. The words, "Let them eat cake," though falsely attributed, captured the sentiment that grew among the people that their rulers lived in gilded bubbles, blind to the misery outside. Versailles itself became the ultimate symbol of this blindness. A palace where disease and filth thrived among nobles, even as the people imagined them wallowing in luxury. The truth, that nobles too suffered humiliation and illness, was less important than the image, and the image was devastating. For Marie Antoinette, the tragedy was that she was trapped in the same golden cage as those before her. Her baths did not grant her freedom, only a mask of comfort within a palace that remained unbearable. She may have believed she was carving out a sanctuary, but to the people beyond the gilded gates, she was carving out a coffin for her reputation. Versailles had long been a monument to contradiction, and under her reign it became a symbol of betrayal. The queen who sought cleanliness was seen as indifferent. The woman who sought dignity was painted as decadent, and the palace that suffocated its own nobility became in the imagination of the people the palace that suffocated France. Thus, the gilded baths of Marie Antoinette tell us less about luxury and more about alienation. They remind us that Versailles was never simply a palace of filth. It was a stage upon which appearances were always more important than truth. When the queen filled her tubs with scented water, she did not wash away the filth of Versailles. She merely added another mask, one that deepened the divide between monarch and people. And when pamphlets described her baths as proof of decadence, they were not inventing a lie so much as seizing upon the larger truth that Versailles itself, in all its perfume and gold, was detached from the realities of life, and that the monarchy had lost touch with the very people upon whom its survival depended. So let us close this part with the image of Marie Antoinette, sitting in a gilded tub surrounded by roses, seeking relief from the humiliation of a palace that stank of excrement. And let us remember how that image was twisted into a symbol of tyranny, how the whispers of her baths became shouts in the streets, and how Versailles, instead of cleansing itself, merely drowned deeper in illusion. In the next part, we will step beyond her chambers into the palace as a whole. For by the 1780s, Versailles had swollen to hold nearly 30,000 souls. And it had become no longer just a palace of contradiction, but a golden coffin for an entire regime. A place whose filth became political dynamite, and whose stench helped ignite the flames of revolution. My dear listeners, we have now wandered, with slow and heavy steps through Versailles, as it rose in perfume and filth. As noble women drenched themselves in fragrance to cover humiliation, as epidemics swept through its gilded halls, as silk shoes were ruined upon marble stairs, and as Marie Antoinette herself retreated to gilded bathtubs that became not symbols of dignity, but of detachment. And now in Part 8, we must face the palace as it entered the last decade of its monarchy. For by the 1780s, Versailles was no longer merely a residence, or even a theatre. It had swollen into a golden coffin for a rotten regime, and every whisper of filth, every stink of neglect, every rumour of luxury became political dynamite, igniting the fury that would soon burst across France in revolution. By the time Louis XVI sat upon the throne, Versailles had grown beyond recognition. What had once been a hunting lodge that barely held a handful of nobles had become a monstrous organism housing nearly 30,000 people. A small city trapped within walls that had never been designed to sustain such numbers, and the strain upon its fabric was unbearable. Corridors overflowed. Apartments meant for one family were divided among three, and servants slept in stairwells or hallways, their lives reduced to constant motion in the service of rituals that no longer inspired awe but only weariness. The palace itself was bursting, and with its swelling came even greater filth, for the waste of tens of thousands of bodies had no place to go, and the perfumes and roses that once masked the stench now seemed laughably inadequate against the tide of excrement that soaked into floors, corners, and gardens. Versailles was not a palace of civilization, it was a compost heap draped in silk. The reputation of Versailles, once the pride of Europe, began to shift in dangerous ways. Where once foreign ambassadors had marvelled at its halls, now they reported with growing disdain that the palace was habitable only for those with dead nostrils and iron stomachs. Where once the French people looked to Versailles with distant admiration, now they spoke of it with bitterness. For pamphlets circulated through Paris, describing it as a golden sewer, a place where nobles wallowed in filth, while peasants starved. And in those pamphlets, the sanitary horrors of Versailles were no longer private shame but public weapon, metaphors for a monarchy that cared more for appearances than for survival. The palace's stench became the monarchy's stench, and the people began to believe that both were beyond cleansing. Marie Antoinette, already maligned as frivolous and out of touch, became the lightning rod for this fury. Her gilded baths, her perfumed chambers, her carefully curated image of elegance. All of these were seized upon by her enemies as proof that she was indifferent to the hunger of her subjects. The truth? That Versailles humiliated nobles and courtiers as well, mattered little. What mattered was the image of a queen who bathed in scented water while the nation starved. The palace's filth was transformed into a symbol of moral decay. Its stench, a metaphor for corruption. And the revolutionaries needed no further evidence than Versailles itself to argue that the monarchy was rotten to the core. The irony was cruel, for Versailles had been built as the ultimate monument to power, a golden prison designed to domesticate the nobility and display France's supremacy. Yet by the 1780s, it had become the greatest argument against monarchy. The very features that had once dazzled the endless mirrors, the soaring ceilings, the sweeping gardens were now mocked as hollow, distractions built on a foundation of waste. The palace was not a symbol of glory but of failure, and the people of France began to see it less as a wonder and more as an insult. A golden coffin that trapped not only nobles but the monarchy itself. Accounts from the time tell of the stench that never left the palace, of the marble walls impregnated with odours so deep they could not be scrubbed away, of fabrics and draperies ruined beyond saving, of wooden floors that had absorbed waste until they reeked. Workers tasked with cleaning spoke of literal tons of filth hidden in stairwells and corners, the accumulation of decades of neglect. And when revolutionaries stormed Versailles in 1789, they found not only the dazzling hall of mirrors, but also the undeniable evidence of rot, a palace that smelled less of roses than of centuries of human waste. This was no accident of history. It was the inevitable result of a system that chose illusion over truth, etiquette over dignity, appearance over survival. For the French people, Versailles was more than a palace. It was a metaphor for everything they despised. To them, it was proof that the aristocracy lived not in refinement but in corruption, that nobles were not models of elegance but prisoners of filth, and that the monarchy itself was so detached from reality that it could not even provide the most basic conditions for its own elite. When pamphlets described Versailles as a golden sewer, they were not merely attacking architecture. They were attacking the very principle of absolute monarchy. And in those attacks, the people found their rallying cry. The palace became a coffin, and inside it lay not only the dignity of the nobility, but the legitimacy of the crown. The revolutionaries who stormed Versailles did so with fury fueled by hunger. But when they entered the palace, their anger was intensified by what they found. Beneath the mirrors and chandeliers, beneath the gold leaf and tapestries, lay the undeniable reality of waste. The stench clung to every surface. The marble was stained, and the filth seemed to cry out from the walls themselves. It was as if the palace had preserved its own accusation against the monarchy, holding within its corridors the evidence of centuries of neglect. The revolutionaries saw not the glory of France, but the decay of a regime that had long ago lost its way. And in the filth of Versailles, they found justification for its destruction. The golden coffin of Versailles reminds us that power without responsibility is a curse, not a blessing. That luxury without dignity is humiliation, not civilization, and that the mask of roses cannot conceal rot forever. The palace was not destroyed in the revolution, for stone and marble endure, but the monarchy it represented was shattered beyond repair. What survived was not glory but warning, not triumph but lesson, a monument to the dangers of illusion. So as we close this part, hold in your mind the image of Versailles in the 1780s, swollen to house 30,000 souls, its gardens soiled, its corridors reeking, its nobles humiliated, its queen bathing in scented water while pamphlets painted her as a monster, its people outside starving, its revolutionaries sharpening their anger. Versailles was no longer merely a palace. It was the golden coffin of a rotten regime. And when the lid was finally closed in 1789, it sealed not only the fate of the monarchy, but also the truth that no amount of gold can protect power that has chosen illusion over responsibility. In the next part, we will drift into the final moments of this story, when the revolution erupted and Versailles itself, once the pride of France, became the tombstone of an era, a palace remembered not for its glory, but for its rot, not for its mirrors, but for its stench, and not for its triumph, but for its downfall. My dear friends, we have now come to the final chapter of this long and heavy story, and in part 9 we must allow the rhythm of our tale to slow into reflection, like the dying embers of a fire that has burned too brightly. For Versailles, the golden palace of filth, the stage upon which France's monarchy paraded itself for over a century, did not end in fire and rubble, but in silence and shame. Its gilded halls emptied of courtiers, its mirrors reflecting only ghosts, its chandeliers still glittering yet hollow. For though the palace itself survived the revolution, what it symbolized was buried forever beneath the weight of its own contradictions. When the revolution erupted in the year 1789, the storming of Versailles was as much symbolic as it was physical. The people of France, exhausted by hunger and humiliation, marched upon the palace not simply to confront a king and queen, but to confront the very system that had produced such a monstrous contradiction. A palace of gold that stank of waste. A monarchy that claimed divine right, yet could not provide dignity even to its own nobles. As they entered its gates, they found not only the mirrors and chandeliers described in endless tales, but also the undeniable evidence of neglect: corridors stained, fabrics ruined, wooden floors so saturated with filth that they had to be torn out. What had once been whispered in diaries and letters was now revealed to all Versailles, was not a palace of civilization but a hazard to human health, not a beacon of refinement but a tombstone of decadence. Workers tasked with cleansing the palace, after the royal family's flight, reported tons of waste hidden in stairwells, corners, and ceremonial chambers. So much that the process of cleaning took months. And even then, the stench clung stubbornly to the marble, as though the building itself had absorbed centuries of rot and could never be purified. The mirrors reflected beauty, but the air whispered truth. And that truth was that Versailles had become an enormous latrine disguised as paradise. To the revolutionaries, this was not merely disgusting, it was proof. Proof that monarchy was irredeemable, that power obsessed with appearances had no concern for reality, that the gilded mask of roses was only a veil over decay. Versailles itself became their argument, a building transformed into testimony. And yet, Versailles did not fall into ruin. Unlike the Bastille, it was not torn down stone by stone. Instead, it remained, standing tall yet emptied, stripped of its courtiers, stripped of its rituals, stripped of its illusions. Over time it became a museum, its halls polished, its mirrors cleaned, its gardens restored, until once again it dazzled those who walked its grounds. But what was scrubbed away was not only filth, but memory. Tourists in the 19th century and beyond walked in awe through galleries that no longer reeked of excrement, that no longer echoed with the groans of sickness, that no longer betrayed the humiliation of silk shoes ruined upon marble stairs. Versailles had been sanitized, made safe for admiration, turned into a monument to art rather than to folly. The stench had been erased, but the truth could not be fully forgotten. For diaries, letters, and reports remained, voices of those who endured the reality behind the mask. Voices that remind us still of what Versailles truly was. The lesson of Versailles is not one of architecture or gardens, but of power and responsibility. Civilization is not measured by gold ceilings or marble corridors, not by the height of wigs or the brilliance of chandeliers, but by the ability of a society to grant dignity to its people, to provide water, cleanliness, and health. In this, Versailles failed utterly. It revealed how unchecked ambition can create not only political monstrosities, but sanitary ones. How the pursuit of glory can blind rulers to the simplest needs of life. How appearances without substance collapse into absurdity. Versailles became a metaphor not just for the monarchy of France, but for power itself when it forgets its duty. A golden shell filled with rot, a mask of roses that hid the stench of decay. The women of Versailles, who endured humiliation beneath their gowns, whose bodies suffered infections and indignities masked with perfume, remain silent witnesses to this truth. Their struggles remind us that elegance without dignity is oppression, that jewels without health are chains, and that luxury without care is only another form of cruelty. The nobles who bowed in mirrored halls, who flattered the king while gagging at the odour, remind us that silence in the face of corruption only deepens decay. And the monarchy that ignored the filth until it consumed them reminds us that no crown, however heavy with jewels, can protect a ruler who denies reality. Today, millions of tourists wander Versailles and marvel at its beauty. They gaze upon the Hall of Mirrors. They walk through the manicured gardens. They photograph gilded ceilings and painted walls. But what they do not smell is the truth. The stench is gone. The waste is buried. The humiliation erased from sight. What remains is a ghost of what once was a palace that appears perfect, but is haunted by its own history. The Versailles that dazzles is not the Versailles of Louis XIV or Marie Antoinette, for that Versailles was soaked in filth, and that Versailles whispered of rot. The Versailles we see today is a mask, a sanitized dream. Yet beneath the polish lies a memory that cannot be erased, a warning etched into the soul of history. So let us end this story not with grandeur, but with reflection. Versailles was a wonder and a warning. A palace that shone brighter than any in Europe, and yet stank more foully than any village. A palace that symbolized both the heights of ambition and the depths of neglect. It was the golden coffin of a regime that collapsed beneath its own contradictions. A monument that taught the world that power without responsibility is poison. That appearances without substance are death. And that no perfume, however rare, can mask decay forever. The stench is gone now, but the lesson remains, and it is whispered, still in the silence of its halls. Beauty without dignity is rot. Power without care is ruin. And Versailles, the palace that stank forever, will always stand as both marvel and memento mori. The glittering ghost of a world that destroyed itself by choosing illusion over truth. Then let us close, my dear friends, with a gentle epilogue, as if we were dimming the last candle in the long gallery and letting the palace slip back into its silence. Versailles has carried us through 9 heavy parts, each revealing not only marble and mirrors, but the shadows beneath them, each reminding us that what dazzles in daylight can become unbearable in the dark. Now imagine yourself standing alone in the Hall of Mirrors at night. The tourists gone, the chandeliers unlit, the moonlight seeping in through tall windows. You hear no music, no laughter, No footsteps of courtiers, only the faint echo of your own breath. The mirrors reflect you back 100 times, but behind the glass it seems as though other faces linger. Faces powdered in white, eyes rimmed with fatigue, lips forced to smile through disgust. The roses are gone, the perfumes faded, and what remains is the memory of a palace that once stank of its own denial. The lesson of Versailles is simple, yet it lingers like a fragrance that will not fade. Gold cannot cover neglect. Power cannot silence truth. And beauty without dignity is only another form of decay. The Sun King dreamed of immortality, and in a way he achieved it, for his palace still stands, admired by millions. Yet his true legacy is not the gleam of chandeliers, but the warning whispered in the walls that when rulers worship appearances and ignore the needs of their people, they do not build monuments. They build coffins. So as you drift now into rest, let the image of Versailles soften in your mind. Not the Versailles of paintings, but the Versailles of memory, half perfume, half stench, half wonder, half warning. Let it remind you that civilizations rise and fall, not by the height of their ceilings, but by the care they give to their people. And that even the most glittering dream can rot if it forgets its roots. And may this story lull you gently, not into fear, but into reflection. For Versailles is gone into history, but the truth it carries is forever. Sleep now, and let the golden palace fade into the night, a ghost of beauty and filth that whispers across the centuries.